The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates extending the student loan payment pause would cost another $40 billion. That would make the total cost nearly $200 billion. Joining me now, President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Maya MacGuineas. Maya, it's great to see you. This is a conversation we've been having all hour, and it's a really big deal for people who did pay their student loans, for people whose parents worked their fingers to the bone so they could put them through college. And we're sitting here right now and after the pandemic, 2 years out of a pandemic, and we're looking at continued pauses. This is the 8th time this administration has paused student loan payments. You know, they want to forgive the $10,000 to $20,000 per person under a certain income threshold. That's about a $400 billion price tag.
Yeah, this is a really big deal, and it's a policy that, while I think we all understand that there are many people who are truly struggling with student debt, and that's an actual problem that we have to think about, this does not solve that. And in fact, this is a policy that is incredibly expensive, it's inflationary, it's regressive, so it helps people who don't need it more than those who do, and it's unjustified in terms of policy, and it will make the problem worse. So I can't actually think of a single justification for why this is the right policy to fix the problem the administration is purportedly trying to fix with this. It's going to cause a lot more problems, particularly in the economy and the conditions that we currently are facing.
Right. Well, we're dealing with issues of inflation. We've also talked a lot about how basically the institutions will bake this into the cake, raising tuition prices, understanding that this forgiveness becomes, if it were to become a pattern, for example, that it doesn't really solve the issue of why tuition costs are so high. And that's really the root problem if you wanted to address it.
Absolutely. So what you want to do is you want to have a structural fix to something like this, where the problem is the ways in which we subsidize higher education actually drive those prices up. That's why the price of higher ed is continuing to grow faster than the economy overall. Then politicians say, well, we'll throw more money at the problem. More people are not price sensitive, and it actually drives the cost of higher ed up. We've calculated that overall student debt will be back to the same levels it already is after this very expensive debt forgiveness and very unfair debt forgiveness in just a few years. What you really need to look at is, why are we subsidizing education that isn't paying off for students? Is it because the universities aren't the right ones for them? They're not great higher ed institutions. How come those institutions don't have some skin in the game, which would actually make sure they were more aligned with trying to make sure people graduate and move on to jobs where they're able to afford what they borrowed and they're not borrowing too much?
That's a great point. On the side of the institution, there's also the moral hazard argument on the side of the borrower, right? This is something we talked about during the financial crisis with the banks as well. And you sit back and say, if we start setting a precedent where we tell people you could go out and borrow, and if you get in over your skis, whether it's education or something else, there's a backstop there. There's going to be a government check that's going to help you out. And that is a very slippery slope.
Absolutely. Right now, you're going to have all sorts of colleges and universities encouraging students to take on debt and sort of winking, saying, listen, the chance of that being forgiven is quite high. And if you look at what's happening now, where the Biden administration keeps adding on more policies and programs that are, again, expensive and regressive and don't make sense, they may be right. But we can't afford that. This is an incredibly expensive policy. Not fair. You mentioned this in the beginning. It is not fair to those people who worked really hard, saved really hard, and did pay off their debt. So that creates terrible incentives in the economy overall. And I don't think you can do enough to also point out inflation is at a 40-year high. We should not be doing things that add to the debt and cause people to spend more right now. What we need is people paying down their debt. The irony is we're saying we're going to forgive your student debt, but because we're not paying for this policy, you're going to have government debt that's that much higher on the other side. And we've just stopped paying for anything these days. It's as though we can't get enough of borrowing. That's where we really have to bring in the fiscal responsibility, which is this really worth it? And how are you going to pay for it? And I can promise you the administration hasn't said one word about actually paying for these very expensive regressive policies.
Right, and that's what many folks across the country are worried about. And this is President Biden using executive authority to forgive these loans. Now that's being challenged in the court system. You had a federal judge in Texas saying, nope, you can't do that. And now they're saying, okay, well, while it's under review and while we're fighting that decision, we're just going to pause the payments until June 30th of 2023. Maya, we'll see what happens. We'll continue to follow it and have the conversation with you. Thank you, and have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you.